I'm really honored to be receiving this award today. Thank you to Division 15 and the award committee and all of you in the audience, my academic community, for seeing value in my work. I'm going to try to talk to you today about my journey in studying motivation and the classroom practices that support it. And I'm going to try to start by giving you a little glimpse into how I came to study this. So, really, in a really cliche way, my curiosity in student motivation, where it comes from, how it works, what can be done to help those who struggle with it, goes back really far. In fact, it started with my dad, who was also a psychologist and a professor at a community college in Rochester, New York, where I grew up, and I sort of, to summarize, if you had asked my dad why he became a psychologist and a professor, he would tell you because it was like being the ultimate know-it-all. And what he meant by that was that there was a lot of power in being able to explain why people did the things they did, and maybe even more amazing, predict what they might do next or what they might experience next. And there was a lot of discussion at my family dinner table about psychology and motivation in particular. I have a big Italian family, and my father would lecture to everyone. That's my mom in the front cooking pasta. And just to give you a sense of how long I've been forced to think about these ideas, my dad wrote his own master's thesis on attribution theory and implicit theories of intelligence, okay? You kind of get the idea, right? So let's not give him too much credit, though. My own educational experiences, going to public city schools in Rochester, New York, gave me a lot of food for thought about motivation and classroom practices. Just for fun, that's my husband in 5th grade. I know, right? I wanted to know why some kids just had this incredible passion for school, or art, because I was actually in an art school studying music and theater and photography, while others, including me, sometimes struggled to find passion at school, or just excelled out of a sense of obligation. I felt like, as well-meaning as my teachers were, I couldn't understand why they weren't often able to capture everyone's interest, and why sometimes my black and brown friends were having really different experiences in school and often not even in the same classes that I was in. And I even wrote my junior high school thesis report on student motivation and the roles of culture, parents, and school context. I'm not making this up, guys. I swear to God. I thought you wouldn't believe me, but it's true. Okay. Anyway, you can see that even from high school, I had this strong feeling of needing to somehow improve education and students' experiences in the classroom through the study of psychology, and I wanted to do something that could be readily used. So when I got to McGill, I was lucky to get really great training in social psychology, studying motivation in the context of interpersonal relationships and personality. And then after undergrad, I went to Duke, and I decided I really had to focus on how to use psychology to improve education in particular. So I went to Duke to study with Harris Cooper, who had done the really cool work on teacher expectancy effects and really practical research on educational practices. And it was a really fortunate match because from Harris, I discovered meta-analysis and its power to synthesize and resolve theoretical disagreements, to guide research, and to guide practice and policy. Everything that I wanted to do. And the stars must have aligned because soon after I got to Duke, Lisa came too and became a really, really critical mentor in my thinking about motivation. So starting in grad school until today, I've been spending my career trying to take stock of the practices that support students' motivation, going back and forth between synthesizing bodies of work to find out what we already know is effective and innovating on that work to try to fill in our understandings of motivation and motivating educational practice. And right away, I've always believed that teachers' motivational practices mean the difference between having engaged, motivated students and bored, disengaged students. As I tried to understand that, I realized that self-determination theory could provide a really useful framework for understanding a variety of practices. So according to self-determination theory, we can explain the differences in students' experiences by thinking about their psychological needs, particularly for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and the extent to which the educational environment and students' interactions with teachers or even peers support those needs. So as I started down this path of trying to understand how teachers could support students' needs, I started by looking at one of the most obvious practices I thought could be used to support autonomy and competence, and that was giving people choices. The thought was that when you choose, you feel like you're free, like whatever you're doing is your own, and you feel more in control of your behavior and more competent having been the person to choose what you're doing. So choice is this potential pathway to feeling autonomous and competence, and in turn, ideal forms of motivation like intrinsic motivation, interest, enthusiasm, learning, and performance. So lucky for me, lots of people had asked this question already. But it wasn't ubiquitously positive. There was plenty of studies that suggested that choice wasn't going to have these positive effects on motivation and performance, and psychologists who suggested that choices may not be important to everyone, and they actually have the potential to be overwhelming and demotivating. So when I set out to review the literature and meta-analysis and look at all this, in an attempt to aggregate all the studies that had looked at the benefits of choice by randomly assigning people to either receive a choice or not receive a choice, it became clear to me that decades of psychological research was suggesting that, at least on average, people do in fact feel more competent, more in control, more motivated, and perform better when they're able to express their preferences and make choices. And in fact, particularly encouraging was that the benefits seemed to particularly be impactful for kids in K through 12 level kids. That was really exciting that there was so many lab studies and field studies that suggested that choice could be a really powerful, motivating strategy. But at that point, there was pretty few educational interventions that had incorporated choice into a real classroom, especially in the context of something undesirable like homework. So that was my next step, was like, okay, can we use choice as an intervention that's going to be effective? And so in one study, we had teachers give kids choices of homework assignments. And they either randomly assigned them to give homework choices for an instructional unit, or they weren't given choices of homework for an instructional unit. And then we actually flipped the condition so everybody had choice at some point. And what we found was that when students had choices, they felt more intrinsically motivated for their homework, they felt more competent about their homework, and they even scored higher on their tests at the end of the unit in which they had choices. So choices are awesome, right? We even found in one study that giving people choices could mitigate cheating on a test. Except when they're not awesome. So in additional research that I did after this, it became clear that choices have a lot of limits. When people don't really value the domain that much, choices have fewer benefits. When choice is superfluous because the task is already interesting, not so much benefit. When people don't feel competent about the task, choice backfires and it actually can demotivate people. Let's see, what else? When choice doesn't provide an opportunity to express your identity, not so great. And I probably don't even have to say that in the wrong hands, choice can become pretty controlling. Like, I can do this with my 3-year-old. Would you like to eat your dinner or go to bed? Not a beneficial choice, even though I do it. So, given all these constraints, Another part of my career has been to focus on a lot of other strategies that support needs. And I've done this work with my students over the years. So with Rebecca Steingut, we've looked at the effect of rationales on motivation and performance. With Carlton Fong, we looked at the effects of negative feedback on motivation. With Ariana Vasquez, we focused on parents instead of teachers and thought about autonomy support across a number of practices. This is just a summary of some of those findings. I'm not actually going to talk about it. But in the context of thinking about all these practices that could potentially be useful for teachers in the classroom for supporting motivation, one thing that I kept thinking about was what is really happening on a daily basis? What happens on the days when teachers are supportive or alternatively thwarting of autonomy? And so to answer that question, I've gone to do some diary research. So with high school students in science classes, we've had them report to us on a daily basis every time they've been in science class, right after they've been in science class, their motivation and emotion and engagement, as well as what their teachers did that day. And what we've found from this research is that first of all, there's a variety of things that support autonomy and support students' engagement and motivation in the classroom. And the way to interpret this graph, which is not particularly easy to interpret just looking at it, is that on days when teachers provide opportunities to ask questions and are responsive to those questions, when they provide rationales about why you should learn something that are self-relevant to students, that when they create activities that tap students' interests, and when they give choices, on those days when they do that more than average, students experience an increase in their engagement and an increase in their autonomous motivation or their intrinsic motivation, more so compared to prior days. But the bad news is that on days when teachers slip into controlling practices, when they do things like create busy work or uninteresting activities more than they typically do, or when they actually actively suppress students' perspectives, or when they use a lot of controlling messages, that students actually experience an increase in disengagement and negative feelings, and also have increased controlling reasons for learning. And, you know, I told you I vacillate between primary research and meta-analysis. So if I look across the body of work now on autonomy support, I see the same kinds of patterns. So this is a meta-analysis that I'm working on trying to finish now. So looking across the over 180 correlational studies that have looked at the link between teachers providing autonomy support or using controlling practices and a variety of students' outcomes, you can see that autonomy support as a whole, across those practices I just showed you in that diary study, is linked with a lot of adaptive outcomes, and more so than the extent to which they are linked with reducing negative outcomes. Conversely, controlling practices seem to be linked with a lot of undesirable outcomes for students, in particular, disengaging, and probably the worst one of all, amotivation, not having any motivation of any kind. And that's just to summarize that that's the pattern across all those outcomes. And if you don't like correlational research, which you might be wise to not like, if we look at intervention research, you see the same kinds of things. It makes it really clear that autonomy support as a whole, all those practices put together, seems to have pretty positive effects. Let's just look at that biggest bar right there for autonomous motivation. Yes, that is a G of over 1.5. It can be interpreted the same way as a D. If you don't know what that means, it means that there are 1.5 standard deviations difference between students who had teachers who were trained to be autonomy supportive in the classroom versus teachers who were not. It's big. Okay. And unless so, the autonomy support interventions reduce some of those negative outcomes to some extent, but less so than they actually improve optimal outcomes. And I didn't want you to leave here thinking that it's not heterogeneous. It is. There's plenty of moderators. The ones that seem to be most important are age. So autonomy support seems to be most important during adolescence. And the multidimensional nature of autonomy support seems to be important, with the biggest effects emerging when many strategies are being used, and not just, for example, choice, which is where I started with this. And I also just wanted to note that as hard as I've tried to find it, I don't see a lot of variation by race or gender or culture. So where I've gone with this is to start thinking about, okay, if autonomy support is so cool and so effective, can it be used to explain pressing societal challenges that we face, like gender inequities in STEM? So I'm sure many of you are aware that women are underrepresented in physical sciences, computer science, and engineering in particular. And it seems to have a lot to do with students' motivation and their motivational experiences in elementary through high school, and not so much necessarily about ability or even exposure to advanced content. So I wanted to see if autonomy support might help explain some of those discrepancies in gender representation in STEM. So I took diary data again, and what I found was, just looking at physics, chemistry, and engineering classes, that girls perceive their teachers to provide less autonomy support in those classrooms and experience less need satisfaction on a daily basis. And in turn, that explained the discrepancies between boys and girls' engagement on a daily basis in their physical science classes. And importantly, there's none of these gender differences in life science classes where girls are represented equally in college majors and careers. So I'm going to try to wrap here by just talking about what is next and what I'm doing now and where I'm going. The first thing I just want to say is that it's clear that autonomy support has benefits. So I hope that I plan to continue to advocate for this approach to instruction, and many of you probably will advocate with me, I imagine. I also think that we need to think about refining interventions so they can intentionally be used to benefit those who might need them most, girls in STEM, to reduce racial and income gaps in achievement, to address motivation declines during adolescence. But hold up. It's not just about what teachers do, it's also about what students do, and students' power and their agency in the classroom. So something that I realized as I was looking at these links between autonomy support and students' motivation, and I'm not at all the first person to realize this, but was that students also influenced what the teachers do. I found that on days when students were more engaged or more interested or more motivated, that teachers actually increased their autonomy support that day or the following day. And conversely, teachers also increased their control on days when students are disengaged. So borrowing this great idea from John Marshall Reeve about agentic engagement, students have the power to influence the very support they receive for their motivation. So traditionally, we've thought about engagement as just having behavioral, emotional, and cognitive components, but there's also an agentic component where students can insert themselves into the flow of instruction and elicit support for their motivation from their teacher, and in turn experience more need satisfaction and more motivation in the classroom. And John Marshall's provide plenty of support for this, as well as others he works with, and I have a little bit too. So I found that on days when students are more agentically engaged than they typically are, that teachers are more autonomy supportive, that students experience more autonomy, like the sense of autonomy, they're more engaged in the other ways, and this is an increase from prior days. So this has made us think that not only do we need to help find teachers' way to be more autonomy supportive, but we need to help students find ways to be agentically engaged. So what we're working on now is interventions that can help put students in a mindset for agentic engagement and be more agentically engaged. We basically communicate that their motivation and the classroom climate and the support they receive is malleable and responsive to their behaviors. And we find when we do that, they do adopt this belief, are more agentically engaged, and in turn experience more autonomy support from their instructors, have more engagement in the other forms, experience more autonomy, and even more personal interest in the domain for which we communicated this agentic perspective. So I want to end just by noting that I think a place I'm thinking about right now to go is this potential magic, as close to magic as maybe we ever get, with education research and thinking about how to combine teachers' support for students' needs with students agentically engaging. So with that, I want to acknowledge my many, many collaborators who are amazing, and I could never do this without them. Thank you for your attention, and see if there's questions.